Hello, it's Dmitry again. Today we'll be going back to the Alexander Romance. Again, this is the medieval romance of Alexander, translated by Nigel Bryant, and it's specifically in the original version it was called The Deeds and the Conquest of Alexander the Great, which was written by Jehan Wauquelin, who was a Burgundian, in the Burgundian court in the mid-15th century. And this is the French medieval tradition or version of the Alexander Romance. Today we'll be reading the episode about Alexander the Great finding the Fountain of Youth. So let's see if we can find it. There we go. This will be chapter, let's see, I believe this is chapter 42. Yes, chapter 42. How, according to history, let's begin. Chapter 42. How, according to our history, Alexander discovered the Fountain of Youth. After seeing the tower completed, Alexander set out with his whole army and rode through the deserts of India for several days before he found anything worthy of record. Then he entered a plain of the strangest kind. He arrived there in the forest, in the fairest weather. But the moment he and his men stopped to make camp, the ground beneath them started belching fire. Awed by his perilous wonder, they struck camp again and moved on. But they came then to a plain as alarming as the first, the ground quaking so violently that it seemed about to collapse beneath their feet. They didn't dare stay, and rode on all night as chance took them. And right through the night they were assailed by serpents and dragon snakes. Never had they endured such an ordeal. And then, after all these attacks by snakes and serpents, when day broke and they found themselves in a field where they thought they could get some rest, a mighty storm struck up. The sky grew dark and dense with cloud. Thunder and lightning raged and flared again and flared, and rain fell in fearful torrents. And this rain was as red as blood, so red that the army and everything in it, humans, animals, and all their gear, looked as though they were covered in gore. Alexander was appalled and aghast at that sight, and jumped down from his horse and prayed to God in his sweet mercy to make this torment cease. And hardly had he finished his prayer before the terrible storm abated. Seeing the elements suddenly stilled, Alexander was overjoyed, and not without cause, and he went among his knights and men and began to cheer and reassure them, for they were muttering against him, saying, "If we keep following this man, whose rash daring has enraged the gods by trespassing on their domains, he will lead us all to our doom." So he went among them with words of comfort, saying, "O my valiant knights and companions, don't be afraid. My hope is that, God willing, after these torments will come relief. You know it is in the natural way of things that drear drizzle is followed by a shining sun. So, if we've suffered this storming turmoil, there's no cause to be alarmed. So vast is nature's God-given power that it has to be released somewhere." Once he'd reassured his men and they'd eaten and rested a while, Alexander issued orders to take to the road again. They did so, and found themselves passing now through many a pleasant place, but will say nothing of them, as there was little worthy of note. They rode on till they came at last to a beautiful stretch of grassland covered with fair and fragrant flowers, and little trees laden with fruit of a scent so sweet that balm and incense could not compare. Their delight knew no bounds, and they all went roaming across the plain picking violets, roses, and all kinds of flowers, whose fragrance was so reviving that all the hardship, thirst, and hunger they'd suffered were forgotten. Alexander issued orders to make camp there, which they did very readily, the place being so ravishing and they started preparing their ground and pitching their tents, including the king's pavilion. When all was done, Alexander bade some of his knights explore the full extent of this delightful stretch of land. They duly set off, and right in the middle, hidden among the mass of huge trees, they came upon a beautiful spring, a surging gush of clear and shining water. And the history says that before the spring stood a line of pure gold, through which the water passed through a kind of pipe, and around the line were 4 more as if to guard him. along with true dragons. They'd have seen a terrifying. They'd have been a terrifying sight if they'd been alive, but they've been turned to stone by some magic art, and for a very special reason. According to the history, it was because they'd angered the gods by killing the son of a goddess while he'd been bathing there. The history goes on to say that the water from this spring protected men from venom and toxin of every kind, and adds that it was enclosed in a crystalline stone with a border of finest gold. They reported their discovery to the king at once, and rode straight there to see it. He gazed at the spring and its surroundings in awe and delight, and bade that its pavilion be brought there, and that the army come and camp there right beside it. And this was done, and the history says that he decreed that, on pain of death, no one should damage the spring or plunder it in any way. He was thinking of the abundant gold that adorned it, but following the advice of two of the old men who were acting as his guides, he let his men pick as many of the flowers and fruits from the trees as they wished. Now in this beautiful tract of land the weather was fine and very hot, and it so happened that a number of men from the army went to wash and bathe in the stream from the spring. And our history says that among them were some who were very old, and the moment they washed and bathed in this water, they were restored to perfect bodily health and seemed no older than 30. Seeing this, everyone in the army suffering from sickness or infirmity or age came and bathed there, even those who were unwell and didn't need a wash. In fact, everyone, until the whole army was so newly filled with health and there wasn't the slightest trace of illness to be found. According to our history, this spring came from the earthly paradise that lay between the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. There's a little note here that says this. For the note there, it says, along the Pishon, see note 1 above page 210, the Tigris and Euphrates were rivers that flowed from Eden. The Tigris and Euphrates were rivers that flowed from Eden according to Genesis 2, chapter 2, verses 10 through 14. So that's why they're calling it the Tigris and the Euphrates. But they're saying here that it says along the Pishon. So I guess they're maybe like conflating the rivers in India with the rivers of Eden, essentially. When Alexander and all his followers, men and women alike, were thoroughly refreshed, he summoned the old men who were accompanying him and asked them if they knew of anything in those forests and deserts that had not yet been seen and was worth seeing. They replied that not far away was a marvel indeed, in the shape of two trees that gave answers to any questions. They were known as the trees of the sun and the moon. And so that goes into the whole chapter about the sun and the moon trees and the prophecies of those trees. Now, we went over that in a previous video about that, so they kind of lead from one to the other. I also want to make a note here, it says here, about talking about, let's go back to it on this page here, talking about the god that was punished the dragons for killing the son of a goddess while he'd been bathing there. Here's a note on this. It says, this is a clarification of Wauquelin's phrase, because the son of a goddess had once bathed there against the will of the gods. In a convoluted passage, which may well have confused him, his source, the verse Roman de Alexander, concludes, for poisoning a goddess's son, they, 4 crested serpents and 2 dragons, who were guarding the lion, were all killed together by a lightning bolt. Okay, so that was maybe some clarification as to what might have been referring to in some of the older sources Wauquelin was referencing in the first place, in the French version of the Alexander Romance. To go beyond that, a little bit more so, I want to say that both the sun and the moon section, the sun and the moon trees, where they talk about, and I can go talk about that now in this version, they talk about it being in sort of this paradisical land where they have balm growing from plants, and this guy who was covered in beautiful white robes and a golden bed and all this kind of crazy stuff. Both of this section here about the fountain of youth and the section talking about the trees implies they're in some sort of basically earthly paradise, or that they're adjacent to the earthly paradise. Perhaps earlier on we're talking about this sort of adjacent earthly paradise, the Garden of Eden, just like around it kind of thing, where we have these beautiful flowers and things that are better than balm and this fountain of youth. While they go further on, he actually is going up this mountain with sapphire stones, and it's a huge golden mansion. And it has sort of the similar imagery to what you would see in Orlando Furioso, where there's all sorts of precious gemstones and this kind of stuff. You know, it is sort of this concept of an earthly paradise that they cover in both of these chapters, or both of these episodes, you could say. Technically, these are more than one chapter for each of them. So I think it's an interesting development. I also want to confirm on the earlier version of the Alexander Romance. Now, I was having trouble finding the Fountain of Youth section in the Armenian tradition, which is one of the best preserved early versions of the story. It might be that simply that was a later development, the Fountain of Youth, or the Fountain of Rejuvenation. I know it is the one that developed relatively early on, and it's preserved both in the Islamic tradition and in the Christian traditions that developed. So it's probably one of the earlier ones that came about. Now, in the tradition that you would be more familiar with compared to the French tradition, what happens is one of his cooks, named Andreas typically, he would go and he needed to go wash some fish. And so he washes the fish in a stream for cooking them. You know, he killed them already. They're already dead. He washes the fish and it comes back to life. And then he realizes, wait a minute, this is some sort of magical fountain of rejuvenation, and in that case, resurrection. And so what he does is he takes a vial of it, and he gives it to him. He drinks it himself, and he gives it to a daughter. I think it's typically a daughter of Alexander, and entices her with it. And then Alexander finds out later on that not only basically he finds the fountain, he doesn't tell anybody about it, but he takes it for himself and gives it to Alexander's daughter and entices her with it. And Alexander finds out what happened like way later, and they're not able to even get back to the fountain itself. So basically he missed out on eternal life, which is what he wants, right? He wants to live forever, ideally. Most people would say they want to live forever, that possibility, right? As long as they're healthy and so forth. That's a very common human desire, not to die and not to grow old and become infirm. So Alexander gets extremely upset with the cook and with his daughter because of the fact that they basically hid this thing that he wanted from him. And what happens is that in some versions, the two are thrown into the sea, or they jump into the sea to escape him, and they become sea demons. Demon as in like, not like a demon that we think of in like in the Christian context of like a fallen angel necessarily, but like a demon in the Greek or Greco-Roman idea of some sort of, basically like a jinn, sort of. They become these sorts of supernatural entities, and they're sea demons essentially. And another version, Andreas the cook becomes a sea demon, but the woman, Alexander's daughter typically, she becomes a desert demon. She becomes like a demon of the desert, as sort of an alternative version. There's another version which is specific to Thessaloniki, so Thessaloniki, Greece, that area, Salonika, about Thessaloniki, which is what the city is named after, right? She is a relative. I want to confirm specifically what her relationship. I think she's the sister of Alexander the Great. Let me just confirm right now. Let's see. Thessaloniki, sister of Alexander the Great. Yeah. So she is the sister of Alexander the Great. And one of the traditions of the Alexander Romance, which is preserved in the Thessaloniki tradition, is that Alexander the Great gives her a vial from the fountain of immortality, right? I think she either drinks it, or she might have used it, puts it in her hair or something like that. Regardless, though, she absorbs this water from the fountain, and at some point, she is so stricken with grief that her brother died that she jumps off a cliff to her death. That's the intention, right? She's going to end her life by jumping off a cliff. However, this is an important thing. She does not die. Instead of dying by falling into the sea, she is transformed into a mermaid, basically, or some sort of sea demon. And she basically haunts the waters, and sailors have to... She asks sailors, this is an important tradition, who is the king or the lord, and they have to confirm or say to her, this is supposed to be the correct answer, quote unquote, to her, that it's Alexander the Great who was the living ruler of the world, and then she'll let them pass. If they don't say that, well, then she's going to cause some problems for them. So that's kind of the difference in the Thessaloniki tradition. It's his sister that Alexander himself gives the water. In the more typical tradition, it's Andreas the cook and Alexander's daughter who take the water. and they become like sea demons, or like a like a mermaid kind of situation again, like a sea demon and a desert demon. And in this version, of course, everybody's taking from the fountain of youth. And unlike the earlier traditions where they kind of imply that you live forever, right? She jumps off a cliff and then she becomes a mermaid or a sea demon or whatever. In these traditions, they literally change forms into a different creature as a consequence of the waters. In this tradition, in the French tradition we see here with Wauquelin, what happens is that they just become younger. They just have an alleviation of all their illnesses. So it's a little bit different. I would say, though, that this might reflect some of the kind of cultural context. So if we're going to say, oh, it's sort of like the tradition of like the Garden of Eden. Well, you might can think about the Garden of Eden as sort of being this restorative situation. Well, humanity was like Adam and Eve, and they didn't have to suffer death necessarily because sin had not entered the world, and so forth. And so Adam and Eve, by their nature, they're human, right? They're human, but they are of good health, not subject to death, that kind of thing. So it makes sense in the context of that. If it's just flowing from Eden, well, they're just simply restored to good health. They're restored to vitality. But of course, they are still subject to death in their case, I guess, because they still have this stain of sin on them. Now, beyond that, right? They're still going to die, but it temporally, at least temporarily, alleviates their woes and their conditions. However, in the Greek tradition, bear in mind, if you know the story of Glaucus, Glaucus is a Greek god of the sea. And Glaucus was basically he was like I'm not sure exactly what his role is, but in different stories he's either like using a fish, and this is important, he's using a fish or he's using a rabbit, or a hare, really it's a hare. And he's going and he killed the animal, okay? And he's going to go wash it off. And so what he does is he washes the animal, and it comes back to life in the spring. Or he uses, it's an herb. I think it's an herb. So he uses this herb typically, right? And the herb is supposed to kind of season it a bit, you know what I'm saying? Like that kind of thing. He's gonna go clean it off and use some sort of herb with it. And then he realizes that the herb makes the animal resurrect from the dead. Either, again, a hare or a fish. Typically the fish is a more common story. And Glaucus realizes the herb can give him immortality. And so what he does is that he eats the herb, and then somehow or some way, there's different versions of this, but typically what happens is that he becomes a fish. Whatever. He becomes half fish, like a mermaid, basically. And then he goes into the sea, and then he lives in the sea as a god amongst the other gods of the sea. There's other versions, I think, where he like goes mad or something like that, and he jumps into the sea, and then he becomes a mermaid after that. So there's different versions of that story, but that's kind of the same thing you see here in the Greek tradition. In the early Greek tradition, I'm talking about Andreas the cook and so forth, they are drinking from this water. How does Andreas find out? Because he was, trying to clean off a fish, and then it came back to life. And then he says, I'm going to go drink this myself, and then he becomes a mermaid because Alexander chases him down and he jumps into the sea. So very, very similar in the Greek tradition, harkening back to this earlier trope that you see with Glaucus. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's similar traditions as well that are analogous to that. Would not surprise me. And in this later Christian tradition, again, Adam and Eve, they're without original sin, at least originally, right before they sinned. They were perfect. They were fine. They were pure. They were human, though. They were not gods. They were not angels. They were human, but they just didn't have the effects of death and suffering in the world. And so, and the fountain of youth is coming from the Garden of Eden in this kind of sort of Christian context. All of a sudden, instead of turning them into gods or turning them into angels or demons or jinn or whatever, they become just simply restored humans. Again, they will be still subject to death. Original sin still came into the world, and so humanity is still subject to death. We're in a fallen world still, but the idea is that temporarily, by this sort of divine provision, I guess you could say, from this fountain, they are able to have a temporary restoration of health and vigor. So it's sort of a different situation than that. Anyway, so if you like that video, you thought this to be sort of helpful for understanding the Fountain of Youth in the French tradition, and maybe some comparisons to the earlier Greek tradition, which is also, I think, typically preserved in the Islamic tradition as well. If you like that, smash that like button or whatever they say, But hopefully it was useful for you to understanding the story of Alexander the Great as it relates to the Fountain of Youth. So have a great rest of your day. Thank you, and goodbye.